Thank you so much, Melanie. Um, Hopefully everyone can see and hear me okay. Um, Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks very much to the Center for Fiction for hosting tonight's event. It's really special to get to do this preview event to celebrate the book, which I actually have a copy of now. Pre-orders are going out currently, and it officially comes out on December 15th. And thanks as well, of course, to Helene Bertino, a writer whose work I really love, for joining me tonight in conversation. So I'll start just by reading for 5 minutes or so from the opening of the book. So the book opens actually with one very short story that's sort of like a little prologue. And then after that, we start to follow Kate Bishop, who is the main character in the stories throughout the collection, which are linked by character. So the story I'll read from is called You Never Get It Back. It's the second story in the collection and the first story where we encounter Kate. You never get it back. A party was being had, and Kate agreed to go. The party would be held in Cambridge, a 5-hour bus ride away from southern Vermont, where she was working part-time in a lab and living with her mother this first year out of college to save money and think about what kind of future she might want. It was a New Year's Eve party. With the arrival of the new millennium came a legitimate, historic feeling reason to panic or celebrate, depending on one's inclination. The whole world was gearing up. Her old college roommate Esme called to invite her on December 30th, and because Kate was fighting with her boyfriend, with whom she had planned to spend New Year's Eve, she said yes, though not without hesitation. But Esme begged. She didn't want to go alone. She promised Kate that this party would be fun and cheap and attended by Harvard Law School students, including Esme's ex-boyfriend, Paul. Kate and Esme could crash in his studio in the densely populated, Harvard-dominated neighborhood behind the law school if a better option failed to present itself. Both of us? Won't it be awkward? Kate asked. And Esme assured Kate that she and Paul had a friendly relationship and that each regarded the other with platonic affection, but had moved on, going so far as to suggest perhaps, just maybe, if this other thing wasn't working out, Kate might be interested in him. No, Kate said, never going to happen. But Esme persisted, saying that Kate would like Paul. He had grown up in a single-parent household in a little town outside Albuquerque, lived in a trailer, was determined to rise from the lower middle class to the upper middle class. Some men in his position would want to be rich, Esme told her, but he's not greedy. He wants a nice life, that's all. Was Esme herself still interested in Paul? Kate couldn't tell. She made a non-committal noise. You're his type, Kate, Esme continued, smart, brunette, with a working-class background. I was too blonde for him. He called me princess. He hated that I grew up in a bedroom with white carpet. Kate arrived at South Station from Vermont before Esme's Amtrak train came in from the posh town in rural northern New Jersey, where she had grown up. Esme was spending the winter holidays there with her parents, a VP at a pharmaceutical agency and a real estate agent who were both now semi-retired. Esme considered them her best friends. In her mind, they led audacious, iconoclastic lives. In the 80s, when my father was a lowly bench chemist, she would say, my mother out-earned him. They liked to drink and throw catered parties. Kate towed her luggage from the bus station through the chill wind of the concrete-walled outdoor walkway to South Station's main building, which housed the train station. Waiting in the train station's warm, brightly lit food court, Kate ordered a pepperoni slice from Sbarro and ate the slice with a plastic knife and fork to make it last. An hour to spend here at least. But she had been the one to suggest she wait. Go along to Cambridge when you arrive, Esme had said. Paul will be happy to see you. Kate wished she had a cell phone. If the train was delayed, how would she know? She would have to ask the desk agent. The big clock by the black arrivals board read 2:07 p.m. Esme's train was due in at 3:05. She read a back issue of Structure until 2:55 and went to the platform to stretch her legs. Outside, the sky was already darkening. A light snowfall drifted down from the flat gray vault, the wind picking up the dry flakes on the platform, and eddying the snow in small twists like a peel of lemon in a cocktail. The pale light had a muffled quality as if strained through white gauze. Would the party be fun? She gave it a 50-50 chance. A small regret moved through her. She would prefer to be in New York with Michael. But he hadn't called, and what could she have done? Gotten the ski resort's address from his mother and shown up unannounced? No. And anything was better than sitting home on New Year's Eve, worried and humiliated and preparing to break up with him, unless he had a truly dazzling explanation for his behavior. 2 trains arrived on parallel tracks. Passengers disembarked into the cold air, stamping their feet and chafing their hands. Rumi, Esme's voice called from behind her. Esme liked to call her this, as if to reinforce the source of their unlikely bond. Their junior year at Williams, they'd roomed together, matched up by the housing office when Kate's freshman and sophomore year roommate transferred to Yale and Esme transferred in. Before going their separate ways senior year, Kate to a co-op and Esme to an off-campus apartment, they'd grown unexpectedly close. Kate listened to Esme's romantic worries and reassured her about her academic papers, which Esme gave to Kate to read, and after hearing her responses, relentlessly revised into perfection. Esme, in turn, took offense on Kate's behalf when she felt Kate had been slighted and insisted Kate stand up for herself when a professor failed her on an exam when she was in the infirmary with strep throat. She helped Kate with money, too. She had bought Kate's second semester school books on her parents' credit card, knowing the book's expense was a hardship and insisting her parents didn't mind when Kate tried to refuse what seemed too large a gift. And now, unlikely a pair though they were, they stood greeting each other in South Station on the cusp of a new millennium. So I will stop reading there, and Marie will join me, and we'll talk a little bit about the book and about story writing.
Hi, Cara.
Hi, Marie.
Can you hear me okay?
I can. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're perfect. That was a beautiful reading. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I am so glad you read from the title story that introduces so many of the amazing characters that are at play throughout the whole collection. Esme, oh, I have such feelings about Esme.
I'm so glad
I
to hear
imagine
it.
you do too.
I do.
I wasn't, I won't start with Esme, but I would like to circle back around to her. I thought that we could start by asking a question about the general nature of what it takes to build a collection as wondrous as this one. And before we get into the conversation, I just want to tell all of your fans to please keep in mind that you can drop any questions into the Q&A feature. And around 20 of, I'll be asking audience questions, and we really want to hear from you. This is a really exciting evening for Cara's soft launch, as we've been calling it. So please don't hesitate to throw anything you'd like to know into the Q&A feature. And I also want to thank Center for Fiction for having us, which is a place that means a lot to both of us, I know. So thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Center for Fiction. So yes, okay. Can you talk a little about the journey that was compiling and building this collection story by story?
Yes, absolutely. It's been a long journey, and I think an interesting and good one. I started writing stories in college. I took one fiction workshop because the college that I went to was fairly traditional, and so that was all we had was a single workshop. So I was an English literature major, and to take this workshop, you had to apply, and about 50 students would apply for the 12 spots. And I remember feeling terrified because I felt like I didn't know how to write a short story, which is why I wanted to take the class, but I needed to write a short story to get into the class. So that was the very first short story I wrote, was as an attempt to get into the class, and I was lucky enough to get a spot. And I had what was for me probably my favorite class in college, in that workshop, I loved all my classes, and I always would take one class more than I was supposed to. Um, I would beg my advisor to sign off on letting me take an extra class. And he'd always say, this is a bad idea. I cannot advise you to do this. And I'd say, I know, but I did it last semester, so maybe you could sign off again. And eventually he just sort of shook his head and signed the form. So I just wanted to learn everything I could and just get all the classes in I could. I think I didn't understand how much you could continue to learn and explore the world after college. But I really fell in love with fiction writing in that class. It was just so special to me to sit around a table with 11 other people who loved fiction and who were engaging with it by trying to create it themselves. And I think it hadn't really occurred to me that writers were living people a person could meet, that one could meet and talk to, until sitting around that conference table. And those classes, I think it was like Thursday afternoon for 2.5 or 3 hours, those just have a kind of like sacred place in my mind, in my memory. So after that, I wanted to do some more writing, but there were no more classes to take. And so I didn't write for a little while after that. And then after college, I moved to Boston and worked in immigration law because I was not sure what a person could do with an English degree. And I've been told, well, law is one thing you could maybe do. So I thought I'd try it. And I really missed writing stories. And so I started to take classes at night and on the weekends through a community organization called Grub Street. I made some really good friends who also really loved writing, and we started our own little writers group where we would get together and workshop each other's work. And so some of the stories in the collection were actually kind of first written in those very early years of being a writer. I went on to get an MFA in fiction at the University of Arizona, lived in Tucson, which felt like landing on the moon or something at first. It was so interesting to be in the desert after living in the Northeast all my life. And then I spent about 4.5, 5 years in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on the editorial staff of the Southern Review, then moved to South Carolina for a professorship, and then to Brooklyn. So all throughout those years, I was writing stories. And the further I got into the process of writing stories, the more it seemed to me such a complex and varied task. And I wanted to learn everything I could. I wanted to learn how to write very, very, very short stories like Ann Beatty and Lydia Davis and Amy Hempel sometimes do, that are just like a paragraph long, almost like a prose poem. And I read Alice Munro, and I wanted to write these stories that felt like an entire novel compressed into 20 or 30 pages. And I loved Donald Barthelme and Kafka, and I wanted to try writing some stories that were a little fabulous. And so for many years, I was just thinking about stories, not about a book. And it took a while to start to see what it was that I was collecting, to use Peter Ho Davies' essay, Only Collect, which is about the process of writing story collections. He says, it's sort of a profound question. What do you collect? And in a story collection, you're very literally doing that. You're collecting things. And so it was maybe in the past 5 years or so that the stories really started to cohere in my mind into a book. And I think I'd written and published something like 20 stories along the way. And maybe about half of those ended up in the book that I'm holding today. And I thought the stories are so varied in terms of form, in terms of location, because I'd moved around the country and I was using details from the places I've lived. What might really hold the book together as a book? And so I decided character would be the thing. And once I had that, I wrote a few new stories involving Kate, and actually both involving Kate and Esme, because she is such a great character. I wanted to get her back in the frame and to see what would happen. And then the book really started to kind of take shape as a book.
That's incredible. And it seems like the collection found its centrifugal force in Kate Bishop, who is the character around which all of the stories seem to revolve. And I was thinking a lot about how collections are organized when I was reading You Never Get It Back, and how some collections are like this beautiful remnant bag of varied ideas, And other collections are, like a hamlet of unincorporated ideas. But this one revolves around Kate Bishop, almost as if you were turning that character like a crystal in the sun and writing all of the refractions of her. So in some stories, she's older, in some stories, younger, in some stories, engaged. I don't want to give away too much of what happens to her, but how did you discover and decide on which angles of Kate Bishop you would write and include?
Yeah, I love that that description of how the book works. I was thinking of it as being a little bit like a constellation. I love that idea of like a crystal, and the light refracted through it. Yeah, that's exactly right. So I was thinking of her as being a little bit like Olive Kittredge, the character in Elizabeth Strout's book, Olive Kittredge. Sarah Magica has a beautiful linked collection as well that follows the same character through her sort of young adulthood. Hemingway, of course, does this as well. There are a number of writers. Alice Munro in The Baker Maid does this too with Flo and Rose. She follows two characters, one kind of from childhood through early adulthood, and the other, her stepmother, interacts with her along the way. And so Kate was that kind of character for me. And, in a couple of cases, the stories were not actually initially about Kate. They were about a very similar character. And then early readers, when I started to show people a group of stories, some people said, oh, this is great. You could just publish a kind of varied collection with different characters. And other people said, some of these characters are pretty, they're really speaking to each other. They're pretty close in terms of who they are. What if you made them a little further apart or actually made them into the same person? And there are books like Lauren Groff's Florida. I think we don't know for sure always if it's the same character, but it seems like it's the same character from story to story. Matt Clamps and the Cat, you see what feels very much like the same character, but it's actually a different character from story to story. That can be fun too. But I thought it would be interesting to try to do that, to make some of these similar characters some of the same characters. So in a couple of cases, I revised stories to make a character who hadn't explicitly been Kate into Kate. And so then there was a sort of beautiful element of chance a little bit in terms of which moments in her life I was showing. And then I started to wonder, well, what are we missing here? If this is the same character, what would I like to show that we haven't seen yet? And where Charles Baxter talks about counterpointing character, and he says you bring two characters together who wouldn't naturally be together, and you see if they kind of give off light. And so I was sort of looking, where was Kate giving off light in the presence of other people, and then sometimes bringing those characters in.
Oh, that's so lovely. Charles Baxter is unfailing when it comes to saying smart things about how to write short stories. That's incredible. One of the shortest stories in the book and one of its quietest takes place with a dog around a very important moment in a dog's life. I think it's only a few pages. Around what part of the process chronologically, I was curious, did that story come about?
Yeah, and that story is narrated from the point of view of Kate's mother. So it's the one story narrated from someone who's not Kate herself. That's part of that sort of explicit storyline. So that story I actually wrote in grad school. So that was fairly early on that story came into being. And it's one that I've always really loved, and it always felt important to me that be in a book.
Oh, that's lovely. I noticed that class plays a big role in a lot of these stories. And I normally notice that when it's in stories or novels, because it's not something you see very often. Was there something that you were considering turning around in your head? Was there something that was bothering you? Was there something you were working through or thinking toward involving class as you were writing these stories?
Yeah, that's one of those things that I didn't see I was collecting for a while. Thoughts about the experience of social class in America, and specifically the experience of changing social class. So Kate grows up in a kind of bohemian household in Vermont. There's a fair bit of poverty and chaos, and she goes to college then, and she goes to Williams, and she's around people at Williams who come from very different class backgrounds, and that really kind of marks a shift in her life. And I think that's a really kind of profound experience, and one that's maybe a little underwritten or underrepresented in fiction, because it really, I think we're shaped by the way that we grow up. We're shaped by our backgrounds, our socioeconomic class, among other things, being part of that. But then class is something that you can actually change. So you can move out of the social class you're a part of, but that creates a kind of distance. So, what does it mean for a young person to grow up, to change social class, but then to still be a part of their family of origin too, for example? I think that's just a really profound and fascinating question, and one that I realized was on my mind only after I'd written a number of stories and I put them together, and I started to see that that was part of the larger story that I was telling.
Yeah, many times you have to write it all out before you know what it is that you have on your hands. And you kind of see, oh, I've written about the ocean a lot, or I've written about this a lot. And you kind of see where the text, where the prose is winking at itself almost and holding hands with parts of itself. And that's really wise to be able to look at it in revision and then say, okay, this is where I want to emphasize, and this is the song I'm actually singing. And the character that kind of, it seems, embodies this kind of class distinction and the distance between when different members of a socioeconomic class exist in the same family would be Esme. And Esme is, the roommate that she has at Williams. At what point, did you discover Esme, and do you have feelings about her? And if so, what are they?
I love Esme. I do have a lot of feelings about her. She can also be, I think she's, as a character, she can be a bit frustrating. She has her blind spots, certainly, but she's, as a fiction writer, I find her so fun to work with. To once again reference Charles Baxter, who I really love as well. He'll sometimes talk about what he calls a character who is Captain Happen.
Captain Happen. Yep.
Yep. You probably heard the same wonderful lecture that he gives about, that idea. And I find it so helpful, right? A character who just sort of busts into a story with a lot of confidence and energy, and they're going to start to make things happen. And so Kate herself is a little bit, this comes up at the end, if you never get it back, she thinks about how being quiet or making herself invisible in a way is a mechanism for moving through the world, especially in these social classes that she wasn't born into. But Esme, having been born into the upper middle class and just being herself, her very unique self, feels totally entitled to tell people what to do and to make decisions and make other decisions. So she was just so fun to work with immediately because she got things happening on the page. And so right away I knew when I decided these stories would all be shaped around Kate Bishop, that Esme would be coming back and coming back again.
And I'm so glad she did, because she's also one of the most honest characters in the book. And that's always nice. Captain Happen, I guess, perhaps by design, has to be pretty honest. And she also represents the idea of female friendship too. And so I was holding my breath throughout the book, because that normally goes one of two ways in books. Female friendship, it normally ends up good or bad. And all I will say, so as to not ruin the book for anyone else, is that it ends in a very satisfying and necessarily complex place. So cheers to you for keeping it realistic and also necessarily complex.
Thanks. I'm so happy to hear that too. I have that same sort of feeling about female friendship. I think it's fascinating, it's important, it's complex, and it's not always done justice to in our culture, perhaps. And so there's Esme, of course, and then there's also another character, actually two other female friends who Kate has. And I liked as well just thinking about representing the range of types of female friendship that might exist. But I think all of them in Kate's life are positive in different ways.
Absolutely. And tease out different parts of her personality, right? The way good friends and the way good characters do. So they're very good on the story level as well. I see that the Q&A is lighting up, which I'm delighted about. We are going to get to that very, very soon. So please, if you have any questions, throw them in. Okay, so I have a question that I heard a very smart interviewer ask a few weeks ago. Did writing any of these characters or did writing any of these stories change you?
Oh, that's so interesting. I know that being a writer has changed me. I think early on, I wrote a story that I was unsatisfied with, in part because it lacked depth. Had a plot, it was maybe mildly amusing, but I knew it wasn't very good. um, and and I started to understand why. And I think in that moment, I started to think about how being a writer involves learning things about technique, of course, but also just thinking about how you see the world and what you have to say about the world,
Mhm.
and how it's like such a profound challenge. And I think that's one thing that drew me to writing is you can never be done with it. You can never be done learning about the project of writing fiction because it's endlessly variable and demanding. And you can never be done looking at and thinking about the world. So I'm not sure that I can point to one story, but definitely being a writer has changed me.
Oh, that's such a lovely answer. Yeah. And do you find that there is a quality? I We are both teachers as well. And so I wonder, when I heard you talk about your experience in college, kind of badgering your professor to be in these classes, which is similar to what I went through from a very early age, trying to get into these classes and learn as much as I could about writing. Do you find that now when you are at the quote unquote head of the table or head of the classroom, do you find that that experience of that desperate longing and wanting to be a writer and what you've understood about being a writer since then affects the way you go about teaching young writers how to be writers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I feel like it's such a privilege to get to be in that room and to be at the head of the table, just as I felt it was a privilege to be sitting around the table, just to share that space with other people who want to think about these things. I always have this desire to give my students everything I wish I had known or had when I was 18, even though what I had was so much, because I did really love that experience. But I like to talk to them sometimes about how being a writer is an extravagantly wasteful process. I think I might be quoting Deborah Eisenberg there. She's got a great essay called Resistance. But to me, that was something I think I needed to learn by experiencing it, but it was so helpful to learn that just because you write a story that doesn't quite come together, or just because you stare at a wall for 2 hours, or right, none of that time is wasted. It's supposed to be this sort of extravagantly wasteful experience. That's just part of what it is. And I say waste, in love and in jest, because that's what it takes to finally produce that finished story. I know when I was first writing, I wrote one story that wasn't very good. And my professor circled the first paragraph, or maybe two paragraphs at the most, and said, "This is good." And that was basically what he had to say about that story. And he was right. He was right. And I went home and I looked at it and I thought, I knew that. I knew that. And I just took those two paragraphs and I started writing an entirely different story using that same beginning. And that story actually ultimately ended up, after revision, being one that's in the collection today. So the extravagant waste, I think, is something I want to tell my students about. And I also sometimes just ask them, I think sometimes young writers, either as I did, come to the process with a kind of hesitancy, do I have anything to say? Could I possibly do this? And they see so clearly the gap between what they want to be producing and what they are producing, which is a hard place to be when you can see that, but you're down here, necessary, because that's how you finally come to close the gap. And then other people sometimes come to the process with a whole lot of confidence and brashness. And the first time that they're told, oh, there is this gap maybe happening between what you wanted to convey and what's actually being conveyed to the reader, that's really tough for them to face. That wasn't my problem because I could see that gap so clearly, but I think there are those sort of two types of positions people often occupy. So I like to talk to my students a little bit about that, just to say, you know, if you feel that hesitancy, don't worry, it just means that you can see where you want to get, and you will get there eventually if you sit with it. And conversely, if you have that excitement and enthusiasm, and then it's hard to come to see that gap, just know that that's also an important part of the process. And again, that's what's going to help you finally create that story that will move readers in the way that you want it to.
Is that an example of something you wish someone had told you when you were 18 in those classes?
Maybe a little bit. And I think my professor did in some ways. He was very, very encouraging, very supportive. But I do maybe wish someone had named that a little bit more explicitly for me, so that I knew what I was dealing with. He, you know, one of the stories I finally wrote in that workshop, he encouraged me to send it to the New Yorker after really not liking some other stories, right? And circling just 2 paragraphs and saying the rest needs to go. And so that felt like hard-won praise, and it meant so much to me. And the effect was to terrify me into silence for several years, because I was afraid I'd never write anything as good as that again. And I sent that story nowhere. So, you know, I think just knowing that it's not a fluke, and that if you write a story after a story you're happy with that isn't working, that's okay. You can revise it. It's not some judgment on whether this is something you can do. I think that would have been helpful for me.
Oh, wow. So if I'm understanding correctly, writing a successful story stymied you?
Yes.
Well, what are you going to do now? I'm worried that this means you're going to be stymied after writing a successful collection. How are you making sure that that doesn't happen? How are you psychically protecting yourself?
Well, I think the many years in between then and now have toughened me a little bit.
Oh, thank goodness. Thank goodness. I was thinking about, I want to see where we are with time. Okay, so we're almost at questions actually. So I will ask only one of the questions I have left. So but I am so curious about your answers to both. You know what, if you don't mind, I am kind of I am a fan of the line level. So I'm going to ask you a line level question if you don't mind. When I teach, you know, you can build a line out of so many things that we can technically advise about, but then there is something else, the ineffable, this quality that's very, very hard to articulate. And sometimes when I do try to articulate it and I fail in class, I call it the insight level of a book. A line that seems to turn its head and actually look at the reader a little bit, where the cards are, you know, metaphorically shown. And there were many, many gems on the line in You Never Get It Back. I thought I would just read 2 and then ask you what goes into your understanding of building a line, like literally the nitty gritty of it. So in the title story that you were just reading from, there's this line on page 17. Paul didn't appear to notice. He had a way of noticing small things when they might add to a person's comfort, her silence at the table, and not noticing them when they were embarrassing or awkward, a form of social grace she liked. So that's the level of insight in the character, in a characterizing way, which I thought was so lovely. And then on page 109, in another great story called The Sea Latch, there is this beautiful movement in language. And you and you must know that I really love this line because it has to do with a Red Sox game. A team of which I am not a fan. So you know that I love this line on page 109. To watch the Red Sox game. Oh, wait, I'll start earlier. Agnes and my mother settle in at the motel after dinner, and I leave to go for a drive by myself. To watch the Red Sox game, I say, but really, I just feel lonely. I hope being alone will make the loneliness invisible, like hanging a white canvas on a white wall. Ugh, I mean, anything articulating the shared collective understanding of loneliness makes me so happy. But that surprised even me. Hanging a white canvas on a white wall. It's just gorgeous, Cara. How do you build these lines? How do you know what to include and how to describe?
That is a beautiful and a profound question. I just took a wonderful master class through a public space with Christine Scutt, who's one of my very favorite fiction writers, and she writes the most beautiful, crystallized, surprising sentences that I've maybe encountered in fiction. And she read a part of an Elizabeth Hardwick novel with us line by line, just recounting her reaction to every single sentence, which was, I would listen to her do that every night for the rest of my life, I think. Some sentences, I labor over, and then other sentences just kind of arrive. And I can't remember now, how each of those sentences came to be. I do remember the sentence about Paul, just, spending some time thinking about that character and thinking about people I've known who I found charismatic or whose presence was enjoyable to be in, and wondering why that was. And it took a while to come to see, oh, that's something that's so appealing about a person, when you know that they notice a lot, but if it's something that's awkward or embarrassing, they just seem not to notice it. Not to be pretending not to notice, but they seem genuinely not to notice. But they're observant, because when someone's not being included in a conversation, for example, they draw that person in. And so building that character was a process of asking myself some questions about my own experience of the world. And then sometimes I think I try to think about how I would describe someone out loud to a friend. I often try to imagine that I'm addressing the stories I write to someone who's really close to me, who's intelligent, and who is someone who I have some sort of kind of intimate relationship with, some close relationship with. And then that other sentence, I really do love visual arts. And of course, that comes up in the book a fair bit as well, visual art, which Nicole Caputo, who designed the cover, was thinking about, she said, when she designed this beautiful cover, which I love so much. I think figurative language is a great way to enliven a sentence. And I love when figurative language seems to come from the character's mind and worldview, and surroundings in some interesting and not totally obvious perhaps way, or when it makes something present that wouldn't otherwise be present on the page. So in Olive Kittredge, it's so fun to trace the metaphors and similes on the page, because they often have to do with the main landscape in some way. So the landscape is so present, not usually through literal descriptions of landscape, but through the figurative language. And of course, it makes sense. That's what the characters would think to compare things to. And so painting, one of the people Kate is romantically involved with, of course, is a painter, and she's interested in the visual arts. And so that metaphor, or simile rather, arose, I think, from that kind of question.
I love that. I want you to come in and talk to my classes about figurative language. That's beautiful. Christine Scott, too, is a master of the miniature, and she has said so many things that I have written down, scribbled down. For instance, she unlocked so many things, actually. The ending of anything should be a profound reimagining of the beginning, which I heard her say, and then I was like, will I ever have trouble writing an ending again, when she just mapped it for me so perfectly. And she talked about moving opportunistically along the line. And that's exactly what you do. You're such a writer of the exact and quiet gesture, Cara, and it's just a real joy to be able to help you launch this beautiful book. And with that, I see that there's so many questions. Why don't we hear from your fans? The first question, Kristen Page Gordon. Kristen Page would love to hear you speak about revision, your process in terms of individual stories and also the collection as a whole, particularly because it sounds like characters in the collection are repeated in various pieces. So yeah, could you talk to us a little bit about your revision process?
Yes, and that's a great question, because for many years, and maybe still, it's been my Achilles heel. So when I was first writing stories, I couldn't really imagine how to revise them, except by, as I described in that one case, just lopping off most of the story and getting rid of it and just starting again, which is a very dramatic kind of revision process. And it was right in that case. But for a number of years, I tried revising stories, and they just seemed to get muddy instead of coming into sharper focus. And I remember talking to my partner, Cam, when we first started dating, and he talked about how much he loved revision because he's a writer too. And I got, I think, like a little bit upset about it. And, you know, just said that revision didn't seem to work for me, and everyone always said it was so important. But for me, you know, sometimes stories arrived and they felt right. And if that didn't happen, I didn't know what to do. And so I sort of trained myself over the years by trying different techniques. So the sea latch, for example, I wrote a version of it that was very much sort of like the Mavis Gallant story when we were nearly young, which I loved so much. And I should say briefly here that I should have also thanked Brandon Taylor at the beginning for choosing my book for the prize. And he also loves Mavis Gallant and Alice Munro, who are two writers I've really studied and thought about a lot too. So I think maybe he also has mentioned that story. When we were nearly young, everyone read it. It's like 7 pages, and it's a perfect story, and it's told almost entirely in summarized time. So I had a version of the sea latch told in mostly sort of summarized time and exposition. And then I tried doing a version of it that was told entirely in scene. And I ended up sort of taking from both of those versions and weaving those versions together to end up with a story that kind of moves in and out of summarized time and exposition and scene. And I also at some point realized the character was maybe a little too, Kate wasn't quite doing enough on the page. And so I tried very briefly making her male as a way of just freeing my imagination and maybe letting that character express more anger, just act out a little bit more, just sort of, which of course I know and believe women can do.
I'm way ahead of you. Yep, we know this.
Something about this, making that character into a young man instead of a young woman allowed me to just explore some different facets. And then I went back and again made that character female. So that was I don't usually revise stories that way, but that was the process for that story. I think over time I've come to produce drafts that feel more really like they are themselves by the time I get to the end of the first draft. And then it's a question of just removing a little bit and adding a little bit here and there until you do have that sense that things have kind of snapped into focus. I think earlier on, I was just pushing out in one direction and seeing if it worked. And if it didn't, I was pushing out in a different direction. I don't know if that's helpful.
And by this point, I would imagine you also have readers in place who will help you throughout these revisions too, who have the eyes that you can trust. That's
true. Yeah, I always, I have really excellent readers. I probably should use them more than I do. I'm so aware of everyone's time and how valuable time is as a writer. But my partner actually is a writer, as I said, and he's one of my best readers, and I'm endlessly grateful to him, certainly, and to others who help me see the stories more clearly. Time can do that too, but other readers are invaluable.
Absolutely. Cheers to Cam. for sure. A moment of appreciation. Um, Another question, could you name a few of your favorite short story collections, perhaps authors who might be less well known?
Yes, absolutely. And I love that kind of question. I'm always telling people, writers I love, who I hope that they'll read. So Sarah Majka's book, Cities I've Never Lived In,
Mhm.
really beautiful book put out by a public space and Grey Wolf in partnership with each other. I think she's one of our best short story writers. And her stories are really haunting. They often deal with poverty, with art, with intellectual life. They're often set in Maine and in the Northeast.
Mm.
And that's a linked collection that also has a few stories that are a little bit magical, which I think is really interesting. It's primarily realist, but she's not afraid to blur the line between what's real and what's fabulous. Um, let's see, I recommended on the Center for Fiction's Instagram today, Optic Nerve by Maria Gainza, who's an Argentine writer. That's a sort of a novel and stories put out by Catapult, about a woman who's an art critic. And the stories have a kind of essayistic component, which I think is just really interesting and really beautifully done. They feel like a little Sebaldian, but they move along much faster and they're more crystallized. So Optic Nerve by Maria Gainza. Everyone, of course, I'm sure knows Mavis Gallant and Alice Munro. Let's see, who else would I mention here? And the question was short story writers specifically.
Yes, specifically what those who are not as well known.
Mhm. I would also say Stephanie Vaughn, who has a book called Sweet Talk. It's the only collection of stories she's ever written.
Mhm.
Really, really excellent stories. Um, so maybe that's a good list. I could keep going for quite some time.
That's an excellent list. And throughout the whole conversation, you've been speaking about other writers who you really like. So I feel like there's a treasure trove there. You're really good at speaking about literature, Cara. Were you ever like a bookseller or anything? You'd be really good at giving recommendations.
That would be one of my ideal jobs, I think, because I love this stuff so much and I always want to tell other people. No, but I took a lot of literature classes in college, and then being an editor, I think I would edit the Southern Review, the magazine, and then I would go to conferences and tell
Uh-huh.
people what I'd published and why I wanted them to read it. So I think that gave me some practice as well.
Absolutely. Being an editor will do that. Absolutely. Another question, just thinking about how you mentioned Olive Kittredge, I'd love to hear you talk about whether it was an explicit decision to write this as a linked collection and not a novel. Did you feel like going with a story collection gave you more room for variety and experimentation?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about what a linked collection can do. I actually, as I was thinking about what a book would look like, I put together a graduate class on the linked collection, because as my partner says, my motto is why do it when you can overdo it? But I like to go really deep. And so I spent several years reading a lot of linked collections and thinking about collections, from, say, Laura Vandenberg's The Isle of Youth, for example, that aren't explicitly linked, but they feel linked because of the sort of concerns and echoes that come up in the stories, through to things like Jhumpa Lahiri's A Temporary Matter, one of my very favorite books, which is held together by place, and in fact by several places in dialogue with each other, India and America, and specifically out in Boston, through to Justin Torres's We the Animals, beautiful lyrical coming of age story that I understand began as sort of a linked collection and really grew into a novel.
Mm.
So as I thought about what I wanted to do, I loved the story form, and um, I wanted to include stories explicitly, not chapters, but stories, things that were their own contained little worlds. But I did want to kind of stay with the character and build something that felt like it was kind of building over time. And so I decided, yeah, I could write a novel using these same characters, But a novel usually is much more continuous. Not always. There are interesting experimental novels that can be discontinuous and jump around a lot, but usually they feel a little bit more focused and continuous. I like this quality of shining like a spotlight on these moments in the character's life that felt meaningful without having to build a plot that incorporated all of those moments. So that's ultimately what I decided I wanted the form of the book to be.
Amazing. Do you feel finished with Kate Bishop?
Ooh. um, I don't know that I do. I actually have one story about her that isn't in the collection that came out in Copper Nickel in a literary magazine after I'd sent the collection off to the contest. And I think the more I wrote about her and about the same set of characters together, the more fun I started to have and the more I started to imagine other things that might happen for those characters. So, Hemingway, for example, wrote about Nick Adams throughout his life, and then those stories were collected, kind of later on, actually. And I think it's fun to think about having a set of characters you kind of check in on, throughout different moments in your writing career. So I might write about her again in the future. I hope that the subtext in that question is that maybe readers would be interested in hearing more, and I would be thrilled if that was the case.
Absolutely. Well, yes, that for sure. And also, just from a writer's perspective, I just had a feeling, because when you spend so much time with someone, I feel like there is always a necessary feeling of unfinished business if you love a character who you've spent a whole book with. I just had a feeling that perhaps we weren't finished hearing about Kate Bishop, and I hope we're not. I really hope we're not. So maybe the last question, where are we? Let's see how many more we can get to. I think this is a really good one because we all need some inspiration sometimes. You mentioned that you didn't write for a while after college. How long did it take you to get back to writing, and what helped most?
I think it took me maybe 2 or 3 years to get back to writing, which felt like so long back then. Now it doesn't seem really like that long. Time goes by a little faster, I think, when you're older. But it felt like a long time. And what helped me get back? I think reading always helps me get back. And there's some writers who, when I read them, I don't want to write, actually. I want to go away and be quiet and just think about their work. Then there are other writers who bring something out in me, and it's almost like I want to speak back to them or something. There's something generative about reading them. And I think I read some writers who felt that way for me. And then finding my way back to a workshop and knowing that I had a deadline and a group of people who were expecting to read something I'd written. Sometimes those external pressures, especially when I was first starting out, were the most helpful things. And so I always think deadlines they're a tool to help us accomplish something we want to accomplish. So if you're having a hard time, if you feel a little stuck, I think reading and finding those writers who make you want to respond in some way, and then maybe coming up with a deadline and some sort of audience might be helpful too.
Great advice. Another question. I love that this begins on New Year's Eve, entering the year 2000, before cell phones were everywhere. What made you choose this starting point and time period?
Yeah, it's I'm part of, and Marie too, I suspect we're part of this kind of micro generation who experienced, a world kind of before the internet, before cell phones. And then when we were relatively young, those things came into being. And that's really interesting to me, thinking about what life was like before and what it's like now. Elif Batuman's novel, The Idiot, which I really love, is set in a similar moment. Speaking of writers who go back to characters, she's now writing about that character in her new novel, which is out soon. So when I was looking at my stories and deciding which story to begin the collection with, I have this very brief story called I Met Lost the Other Day, and then You Never Get It Back. Really, I think it is the beginning, because it's where we meet Kate. And I thought that that moment just felt like such a momentous moment in history. Perhaps some people remember the worries about Y2K, for example. It really felt like we were moving into the future in that moment. And New Year's Eve, of course, is one of those moments of renewal and change as well. And so it just felt like an auspicious place to start the collection. I thought at some point about going in a purely chronological, order and beginning with the childhood stories, but then it just felt so right to me to start in 1999 on New Year's Eve. And when I had that, the stories really started to then kind of fall into place.
Lovely. So important when you figure out exactly where to begin. That's one of the hardest decisions, I think, in a book. Well, it is just so lovely to be here celebrating with all of your fans and the people who have obviously been on this journey with you, who I'm sure, the book holds too. And, the Iowa Award, which this book won, is life-changing. And I just wish you I hope that you had even a quarter of the fun that I had after Safest Houses, received the same distinction. And I just feel so certain that you will. So is there anything else? I guess I should give you an opportunity to say, is there anything else you'd like to say tonight to let people know about the book, or perhaps your actual launch event, if that's ready to be shared?
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been just incredible. I remember when Safest Houses came out, I saw the cover and loved it. And hadn't met you yet. I lived in South Carolina, I think, but I ordered the book and just immediately fell in love with the voice and those stories. And so it's so meaningful tonight to be here with you sharing this. Let's see. So yes, the official launch will be December 13th at Greenlight Books in Brooklyn. It'll be a virtual event as well with Alexandra Kleeman. Yeah, another one of a writer I love and a writer we're both friends with. So I hope that people can come to that. I'll also be posting a little sort of book tour schedule soon. It's also available on my website right now. So I'll be doing a few reading series and some other in-person events, including one at the Strand in January. So I'd love to see any of you, any of those places, and to celebrate with you. And thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thank you, Marie, and thanks again to the Center for Fiction.
Thank you, Cara. Thank you, Marie. Congratulations, Cara. And thanks to everybody for coming.